Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Liz. I'm very grateful to be here to speak to you and to give you my story, and hopefully it will convey a sense of a journey that is hopeful. I'm going to begin with a quote. This is by Martha Graham. There is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is or how valuable or how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours clearly and directly and to keep the channel open. I'm a visual artist, and I came to be a visual artist through quite a strange route. I live with a compulsive illness. It's called compulsive skin picking, Dermatillomania. This is my back. This is my chest. These scars are old and healing, and in many cases healed. This is my shoulder blade. Another quote I'd like to read to you. Out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. If someone was to tell me I would be standing in an auditorium speaking to a group of strangers and showing them images of my body, the most private parts that I am most shameful of, I would never have believed them. So what is it? Compulsive skin picking is a complex physical and mental disorder. It is a form of body-focused repetitive behaviour. It provides comfort, pleasure, or emotional release from endlessly picking at often healthy skin. It can often lead to bleeding, infection and scarring, physical deformities, as well as significant emotional and mental distress. I was fascinated by the body. I've always been fascinated by the body. As a child, I started studying theatre right from an early age. But the most significant thing to tell you of why this illness exists in my body and why I carry it with me everywhere I go, including today and with me probably until I die, is I grew up in a very turbulent home. I was very anxious from a very young age. My mum was an alcoholic. She is now in recovery and has been sober for nearly 30 years. But this illness was absolutely crucial in developing a sense of anxiety in my person. As a young child, I had no one to speak to. I rattled around with these very adult, complex difficulties in the family environment. The lady that spoke earlier about that feeling of her dad coming home and causing tension, I lived in a constant state of unease, constantly on edge. And at some point, I went into a bathroom and I sat on the edge of the sink. I was about 8 years old and I had little pimples on my arms. And I sat and squeezed the pimples. Now, we all have spots and scabs that heal and go through this process. We may have picked scabs when we were children. We may still pick scabs. There are probably skin pickers in this audience. 1 in 200 people have this illness. And yet, I went for nearly 25 years without being diagnosed, without being properly supported, without even knowing this illness had a name. Dermatillomania is one of the most common of body-focused repetitive behaviours, along with hair pulling and other disorders, and yet many GPs don't recognise it or know the symptoms. So my journey began really in 2005. Those images I showed you initially were taken by a very, very good friend of mine who's a photographer. And I trusted him. I let him take those pictures. It was a very rare moment. But before that, this started to happen. So I, unbeknowingly, signed up for a master's in dance. I was 29. I was absolutely riddled with compulsive skin picking. My back, my shoulders, my arms, my face, the soles of my feet, my knees. My body was an absolute canvas of this illness. My body was a canvas. I started to document it. The worst thing that could possibly have happened on a course that I've paid money for and signed up for 2 years was go into a dance studio, take a camera with you and document your daily movements. Look at how your body naturally moves, the movement patterns that you carry with you. Look at the dance of your body. This is a conversation for all the students in our year group. And I thought, oh, if I go into a studio and I document what my body does during the day or during an hour or during 10 minutes, I pick my skin. My fingers naturally go up to my face. They'll find a scab on my shoulder where I know there's a mark I can pick. My fingernails trace where that is. I pick the scab off. I drop the scab on the floor. That's the process that my body goes through. And I'm sitting in this dance studio having paid all this money thinking, what the hell am I going to say to people? If people find out, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. But actually, I started to record it. This piece, which I actually exhibited at the end of the course, has more than 8,500 photographs in it. And I started to document what this illness felt like, what it looked like, how it functioned, and I sat with the illness. The ladies that were talking this morning about pain, this was the first moment I'd seen what this illness was doing. I'd actually put a camera on the other side. And that's very significant for me, because this illness, here's a picture of a scar on my face, it functions in front of a mirror. It functions through touch. So for me to be studying dance and actually starting to put these things together visually, the language of my creative practice began. Now, my mum had bought me a scanner for my coursework. You know, here's a document scanner that you can use for doing your articles and your reports and your assessments. And I thought of the joke of people putting their bums on photocopiers at office parties. And I thought, well, what happens if I use this flat surface that I can scan a document on to document my face? Sounds a bit odd, but I didn't have a camera at the time. So this began a whole series of compulsive images. This illness is compulsive, absolutely compulsive. So I thought, what happens if I start to take scans of my face and my face becomes something else? How can I transform this illness? How can I transform my surface? It began a series of images taken at night, which is when the illness happened the most. I would pick in my sleep. What happens if I sit with that anxiety and that feeling? What happens if I start to make something from it? So those moments that were hugely triggering, getting undressed at night, getting dressed in the morning, that's when the picking would happen the most, because we pass a mirror. We have to look in the mirror to get ready to leave the house. What happens if that becomes something I transform? So there's more than 1,500 images in this series. Once again, that sense of compulsion. I'm actively using it. Working with lots of different materials. This is milk. The previous one was soapy water. Working with clay, the face masks that you get in Superdrug and Boots. I started to actually use them and document them as surfaces that are transforming my skin. What happens if the light is switched on and off? So starting to really play with the sense of being visible and invisible all in the same moment. So this is a light being switched on and off as the scanner moves across the screen. I started to think of them as 15-second performances. I had my hair cut, this is hair. Starting to let these everyday moments sort of be included in this weird diary, these compulsive images. What happens if it's a dance and I move at the same time, so my skin transforms across the screen? I stopped seeing me in these images. I started seeing other things. And since I was a child, I've been absolutely fascinated by textures. Absolutely compulsively fascinated by textures. My mobile phone fills up every couple of days because I'm snapping pictures of cracked surfaces, peeling paint. So this language has been with me a long time. My fascination for the sort of textures that I'm feeling on my body, I'm also seeing out in the world. And then starting to transpose them into other things of the way this illness functions. I see my body in fractions. I see pores. I see hairs. So what happens if I start to document them? I'm working with the camera in my hand all the time. The camera replaces that sense of the mirror. I'm constantly working with the camera right close to the skin, right close to the body. That sense of intimacy that this illness makes me feel is in these images. Scrutinizing the skin. This is latex. I made a cast of my chest, and then I peeled the latex off and put light through it so you can see all the beautiful fragments of the skin. This is how I scrutinize my skin every day. It's not just for an artistic image or a creative image. This is the sort of scrutiny this illness generates for me. This is a macro photograph of the ways I tried to think of the skin knitting. It's healing itself. The other thing that's extraordinary about this illness, I've attacked my body for 25 years, and yet it's constantly healing. It's constantly getting better. No matter what I've done to my body, it's still functioning. It's existing. I will carry this skin with me for life. So these scars are part of a tapestry. I started to think of tapestry, sewing. What can be done with this surface? And I keep coming back to the face. My face has been this primary place of picking all my life. I stand here this morning with makeup on that's covering the scars and the marks that, are still with me. And I think this illness will never leave me. I'm just constantly working with it now, having a dialogue with it, letting it communicate. These images were taken in Los Angeles. I did a residency there for a month. And again, it was a dance residency, so I turn up with a compulsive illness, and I've got all these beautiful, wonderful, perfect skin dancers working there too. And I have a scabby back and a scabby face, and let's see what happens with that. There's actually a dialogue that I'm actively trying to have with movement and with other people that are working with the body. It's important. And dance has been so crucial in this journey. This is from a residency I did in Japan. Now, if someone had said to me, I'd be saying I've been to Japan and Los Angeles because of this illness. Hopefully that is expressing hope more than anything. This illness has actually allowed me to access new things, new journeys, new pathways. And rather than it being this demon that no one knew about, I'm now talking about it. I'm standing here today. There was an image this morning of ants crawling on the skin from the pain presentation, and I ticked a box in a great big way. My illness feels like ants crawling on my body, this sense of me needing to claw them away, squeeze them out, get rid of them. Those qualities and that way of speaking, that language is quite visceral. So what happens if you make from it? When I was in Japan, I encountered these enormous insects that scared the life out of me. And actually, I had a whole dialogue with that because this illness has never really gone away in terms of that feeling, that itchy, uncomfortable quality that's with me on my surface. What happens if I make artwork with insects? Let's have that dialogue. It's terrifying, but let's have that dialogue. More recently, I've been able to work with other people. Nearly all of the images that I've shown so far have been completely in isolation. I work alone in the studio. There's never anyone in the room with me. But as I've got better and as I've been able to talk about this illness with other people and share my story and not be afraid to say the truth, I've been able to work and collaborate with other artists. This was a collaboration I did with Manuel Vasson, who's a performance artist who takes photographs of performers. And there are actually 7 other artists collaborating on this project. So I actually had 7 people with me, and to have people in such close proximity to my skin, this thing that obviously is such a frightening thing for me to share with others, was one of the biggest deals possible. And also expressing something that's a thought in my mind, an imaginative idea. How can I have 7 people pulling the skin off my face? I started to work with the skin as a canvas. So I've been working with materials, painting onto the body directly. This is an image of my eye with acrylic paint, which dries solid. You can actually peel it off in one great big piece. There's a constant correlation between the picking, the art practice, the movement. My fingers move in a repetitive way with the camera all the time. So for me, when I'm making this kind of work, I'm not picking my skin, but those qualities are absolutely with me. This image is with pastel dust, and I always had the feeling that it's quite a brutal illness. I mean, obviously I'm describing it in a lot of quite strong language. For me, this part of my body has always felt very tender, and I started to think of it like a bruise. So really, I've been trying to work with the skin as a transformed surface, working with different materials to evoke those different qualities. There's another image of that part of the body painted. And then 18 months ago, I should add, I worked as an arts professional alongside all of this work I've just shown you. So for 10 years, I worked at Trinity Laban, which is a conservatoire for music and dance. I was a professional woman in an arts organisation, doing really well, being very successful, and I was making this artwork about skin on the side. I didn't tell people until 2013 that I was making artwork about compulsive skin picking. If I were to show these images to you those years back, I would have said, oh, I make work about skin, and just leave it at that, rather than explain as I'm explaining today. And 18 months ago, I fell down the stairs at home. I got to the bottom of the stairs and I was crying. My partner picked me up and scooted me into the other room. And I couldn't stop crying. And it was a moment of rock bottom. I got up and sorted myself out. I was black and blue from falling down the stairs. I went to bed, and I lay in bed, and I thought, I feel so much despair. I have no other word for it. I just feel complete despair. And my mum had been saying, you're overworking, you're doing too many things, you're pulled in all these different directions, you're going to come to a breaking point. Don't be silly, everyone's busy, everyone's overtired, blah, blah, blah. The next day, I went to work, I put the face on because that's what you do. You put your face on, you dust yourself down, off you go to work. And I had a panic attack in a supermarket at lunchtime. I went to the doctor that same day, and 8 months of sick leave followed. I didn't leave the house for 5 months. I was diagnosed with severe depression and chronic anxiety disorder. For the first time, I saw a mental health professional. So all of the work that has gone before, all of that artistic process was on the back burner. I wasn't even leaving the house. And the phone rang about 4 months into this treatment process, and I was at home and I was in my pyjamas, as I had been for several weeks. And I have a connection with the Bethlehem Gallery, which is in Bethlehem Hospital. And the manager of the gallery said, we'd like you to do some artwork on anxiety for the Anxiety Festival. We'd like to pay you for it. That's like the dream commission, and yet I'm in my pyjamas at home, unable to leave the house. And she said, why don't you make some artwork about how you're feeling at the moment? And I was like, I'm not making anything. I'm having a bath and I'm watching telly, daytime TV, and I can't sleep, and that's it. And anyway, I accepted the challenge. And I made this work for the Anxiety Festival, and this was last May. So these images are absolutely about the sensations of depression and anxiety that took me over. I already had a visual language for navigating these sensations. This series of images are about panic attacks and about what they really, really felt like in a visual sense. For me, a panic attack felt like blackened lungs. I felt like I was dying. But actually, I hope these images are actually showing that this was the start of something quite transformative. At its worst point, I felt like I was emerging from this inky, black, death-like place. Depression for me was completely all-consuming, and the skin picking went through the roof. I was bleeding from picking on my back, my arms, my shoulders, and all the healthy, wonderful artwork I'd been making suddenly went out the window. And yet from it, this new body of work started to appear. So this work was shown at the Ortus Centre, which is with the Maudsley Hospital. It's a centre for mental health. And as part of it, they said, would you be willing to do a performance? You have this performance background. Would you be willing to make something for it? So for the first time in 10 years, I decided to perform. These are images from the performance that happened in the Ortus. This is what my brain felt like, the chattering, the constant chattering that kept me awake. In a way, that clawing sensation of compulsive skin picking suddenly is in my head. That clawing was in my head. How do you actually get those feelings out? There were display tanks as part of the exhibition, as you've previously seen. So I ended up placing my body in the tank. This is what it feels like to be on show every day in the world when you have a compulsive illness that is on your surface. But from it, I quit my job. I resigned from a full-time job in August last year. By September, I'd started to work with Bethlehem Hospital in the anxiety unit. I have since gone on to work in hospital settings, in therapeutic settings, with school children, with disabled people, with young, tiny toddlers. I'm teaching messy play to toddlers on Fridays. I roll around with macaroni in my hair. And I've also spoken out publicly on television with BBC Breakfast, and I've done interviews for BBC World Service, and I'm talking about this illness. Now, someone had said a decade ago, your greatest fear is actually going to be your biggest asset, and it's going to change your life. I would never have believed them, but here I am. Thank you.